Hi, everyone, and thank you again for tuning into the Policing in America podcast. I'm your host, Sergeant Tom, and I have with me today a very special guest. I'm honored to have Barry Latzer, who is a professor emeritus at the Criminal Justice at John Jay College. Professor Latzer has a number of works that can be found through the Manhattan Institute, through City Journal, as he's a contributing editor. You can catch him on the 10 Blocks podcast as well. And he has a book out, The Rise and Fall of Violent Crime in America, and a new book that's forthcoming, The Myth of Over-Punishment. Very interested to talk with you, Professor. I'm very excited, humbled that you came on. Thank you so much for being here.
It's my pleasure, Tom. I'm delighted to be talking to you.
So what brought me to you was the articles that I catch on City Journal with a number of the fellows and writers and scholars. And you had one that was regarding police officers, and I believe it was called When Cops Kill. And that was my first exposure. And you go over much of the data that a lot of officers have become familiar with. This idea that when protests happen, it is this projection or this narrative that we are just out there willy-nilly, just shooting people haphazardly, randomly, with zero accountability. And while those things happen in these what I call lightning strike events, there are rare occurrences that happen. But in general, the shooting is a rare occurrence. So what would you say just about that? And then we're gonna broaden it out a little bit, but about that idea that something so rare is often thought of as just commonplace.
You know, when I first started studying criminal justice, I remember a professor, I can't remember his name anymore, who said to me, you know, a cop will be on the force 25 years and never discharge his revolver in the entire time that he has his career, except on the firing range.
Right.
I mean, it's still pretty rare for police to have to shoot or use other lethal force on anybody. Sadly, it happens much more often. I know I have police friends over in England, and they're aghast at how often our cops are shot to death and how often they're shooting civilians. But you know what? When you look at their crime, you see almost no gun crimes over there. Very few gun crimes. So this makes all the difference. And so while your point is correct, the whole occurrence of shootings is a pretty rare event, but compared to some other countries, not so much.
Absolutely. There's really good data on that. And we control for these things. So we look at United Kingdom and we say, well, the population's much smaller. They have a much different relationship with the firearm than the American populace. We have much more diversity. All kinds of things coalesce to create this environment that is the US that's very different than other countries. It's almost an unfair comparison when we hear these, because I'd rather compare state to state, and you could see the difference even within our own country.
Yeah.
But also, yeah, there is a lot of this, and so so this idea of mass incarceration, I have been noodling this in my brain. I've been in law enforcement now for about 20 years, and I've been with this, and I just had a conversation with a family member, and I said, am I looking at this wrong? Because the idea of mass incarceration is this negatively valenced, bad connotation, overly like intentionally done, an intentional nefarious act. It elicits things of mass shootings or mass casualties, mass victimization. You hear mass incarceration, and it's always mass incarceration, comma, people of color, mass incarceration, comma, Black people. It is always ensconced in this. Now, your writings on this and your research is incredible. What do you think of that term, mass incarceration?
I think it's misleading. I mean, mass anything suggests overwhelming proportions of the population. Well, that, of course, is just not true. I mean, only a tiny percentage of the population is incarcerated. And we could argue about whether that's high enough, not high enough, etc. But it's not mass anything. Okay, so that's the first point. It's one of these terms designed to generate, I guess, more anger, but it's not really accurate. You never see a definition of it anyway, Tom. When do you ever see anyone define mass incarceration? So it's a boo word, right? It's a term of opprobrium. That's the point. But when you unpack the numbers, Tom, you start wondering whether there's anything to the claim. For instance, when you look at imprisonment, you want to look at the number of crimes. After all, there should be some relationship between the number of crimes, serious crimes I'm talking about, felony crimes. There should be a relationship between the number of crimes and the number of people in prison. In fact, there are many, many more crimes, many more, than there are people imprisoned. So immediately you have this disconnect, don't you, between the number of offenses and the number of people being incarcerated. So where's the term of opprobrium? Where's the mass incarceration? Where's the awfulness involved here? I don't see it when you compare crimes to incarcerations.
And this is where I believe people who don't really understand data and statistics will then allow their emotions to get in. We hear this term often, the cherry picking of the data. And when I have reasonable conversations with reasonable people, it is this thought of, okay, here's the percentage of people in general. I use this term. There's 41 million people of color, African Americans, Black. I'm not even sure nowadays that the proper terminology of 41 million people who are Black in this country. And I ask my friends who disagree with me, okay, mass incarceration. So what percentage of 41 million are in prison? And the numbers they come up with, I said, remember, mass incarceration. And I said, would it be 25%, 50%? And very few people know that this number is about 530,000 out of 41 million. And 530,000, that has gone down. So this particular cohort of inmates, of prisoners, this is the only cohort, while whites and non-white Hispanics have sort of flatlined. For about the last 10 years, the rates of incarcerations of people of color, Black people, has dropped by about 35%. And so I pause there and I say, do you know this data? Well, no, I didn't know that. And I'm not sure about that. And I said, well, then does the term mass incarceration fit this percentage of people being incarcerated? And then, of course, there is a bit of the cognitive dissonance that kicks in, and to no fault of their own. It's just your brain having to process and deal with this. However, when it is beaten on the drum via the media or via the articles, does the media do they have a responsibility in this to be more accurate?
Well, I think the media, of course, picks up on an issue and hypes it. The reporters are often copying one another. They don't do their own research. They either can't or won't read the criminological studies. The media doesn't help, that's for sure. They just don't help. And it depends on what you read. I mean, apparently, from what we're told, people are in silos. They read the media that supports their views that they've already arrived at, and they ignore everything else. So the media doesn't help. It's not presenting an accurate picture, or more to the point, they're the ones who are really cherry picking. They're selecting data to support their views, and not the data that supports another view. And a good example of this is this Lancet study that was featured in the New York Times, and which really inspired my last little essay for the Manhattan Institute. And that's showing the disproportionate number of African Americans who are killed by police, killed in confrontations with police. Well, what the article left out, I'm sorry, the article in the New York Times, I mean, what the article in the New York Times left out, either because the reporters didn't talk to enough people or because the reporters willfully excluded it, were the number of violent incidents and the proportion of African Americans involved in violent incidents. Now, when you look at that number, that is the proportion of African Americans involved in violent incidents, and you match that up with the number of lethal confrontations with police, then the racial skew disappears. It's just not there anymore. And that's the key number. But that's not what the Times presented. The Times instead said, well, blacks are about 12 to 13% of the population, but they're, and I've forgotten the number now, X percent of those who
30%ish, yeah.
What was the number?
About 30% of the prison population. So they're overrepresented by factor 3.
Yeah, well, I meant the lethal confrontation
yes,
population, but it's also about 30% actually.
Yes, it is.
So they're 30% of the lethal confrontation with police, and they're about 12 to 13% of the total population. So there's clear disparity.
Right.
I don't argue with that. There is a clear disparity, but you got to ask why. If you stop right there and you just say disparity, oh my God, racism, you're going to get it wrong.
Right.
And that's the problem. So that was a long-winded response, Tom, and I'm sorry, but the media does present one side, and increasingly, it's not in the editorial page anymore. It's on the front page.
And I always feel it's important when I'm having the discussion. This has always been a hard needle to thread. When we talk about disparities and disproportions, and then we talk about crime and crime with certain cohorts, I have to make it the point to say this is not a general blanket statement among all people of color, among all white people, among all Hispanics. It is a very small fraction of a large cohort. So you say a 41 million person cohort. But the people committing the crime, we both know you are getting down to a very, you're less than 1% of this entire cohort is committing crime. So I try my best to explain that when we say the black suspect, oftentimes it's this monolith of like, well, why are you saying black people? And I say, no. The black suspect, which is the minority of, it is the very few people we're talking about here. Yeah. And that is just a hard needle to thread. It's hard to get past that because the idea of race and this idea of like the entire populace, it also bears mentioning. I believe Ronald Sullivan is a professor out of Harvard, and he has a TED Talk called Justice is a Choice, and he works with Project Innocence. It bears mentioning that there is historical context for people to be upset. In his work in Project Innocence, somewhere to the tune of about 65 to 70% of the people that they find innocent are in fact black people. So we know that there is a trend of people being, I don't want to say over punished, but we could say wrongfully punished. Like we know that has happened historically, and you have people doing great work reversing those, and people that have spent 20, 30 years in prison, and about 1% of the cases that they find have this. Now we hear about those 1%, and you talk about this. You talk, and this is my lead into you about the idea of the mistakes that we make. You know, how it happens, but also how we're not over punishing. Can you speak a little bit about that data?
Well, there are always going to be miscarriage of justice cases. Whether they're disproportionately minorities or not, I don't know. I haven't really examined that question. That's a good question. It would be an interesting one to pursue. Let's say that it's true. Let's say that a disproportionate number of the miscarriage of justice cases involve minorities. Again, we're going to have to peel that onion. We're going to have to look and see what these cases are about. Why was there a miscarriage of justice in the case? Is that circumstance likely to occur more with African American suspects? Do we have a situation where you have a disproportionate number of African Americans involved? So, for instance, a lot of these miscarriage cases are rape cases where you have misidentification,
Right.
or rape murder cases. Now, we know that African Americans have a very high murder rate, much higher than the white murder rate. Half of the homicides in the United States, roughly half, are committed by African Americans, even though, as we said earlier, they're 12 to 13% of the population. So, is this one of the reasons why you have miscarriage of justice cases with a disproportionate number of blacks? Could be. As I said, I didn't research this in depth,
Sure.
so I don't want to hazard any answers except guesses here. But these are questions, and they're not answers. These are just
Mhm.
preliminaries. They're things that we need to examine, and there should be examination of it. I'm all in favor of that, and discussion of it. I'm all in favor of that. Sadly, by the way, in universities nowadays, you can't even have discussions anymore. We're looking at a very censorious age. It's awful. I retired several years ago, and I got an email from a younger guy who's still working up at the College of Criminal Justice. And he said, "Barry, you don't know how bad the situation is
Mm.
now. I once led off a discussion and it involved African Americans. I don't recall the details now." He said, "I presented some data." He said, "You could have heard a pin drop in the audience. No response, zero. No one wanted to take up the issue. No one wanted to discuss it at all." And I
Yeah.
guess the young faculty are scared. They're afraid to bring it up. Why bust a career? There are plenty of issues to discuss. You don't have to talk about race, right?
Yeah.
And the older faculty are getting the message, and they figure, why do it? So these are questions to explore, and they are worth exploring. And I'm very grateful that I'm retired, Tom, because I could do whatever I want and they can't punish me. They could ignore me, which they often do, but they can't punish me.
Yeah. It is a good spot to be in. I'm still trying to climb that, scale that mountain. So, and the reason I bring it up, Professor, is just strictly because what I want the audience and what I want people to understand is I'm not here just to say everything's great, nothing to see here. Like, there's valid questions, processes, systems can improve. There are things that can be better about policing. Absolutely. I am a big proponent of implicit bias training, of procedural justice training. I'm a huge fan of de-escalation. I think we should have education requirements for our officers. I want a more diverse workforce. I want people from all walks of life having the constitutional authority to police the society and serve the public. I just don't want people to get the idea that, oh, no, we only see things one way. Yeah, there are issues. The problem I have is when the opening statement is, you're a racist and your only existence is to further enslave a certain type of people and to kill people. Therefore, you need to go. And you think, where do you go from there? Like, I'm trying to have a reasonable policy debate about how we can make things better. And correct me if I'm wrong, but this is a civics issue. This is a bureaucracy. Things are going to move slowly. This is not like we're going to have a policy change overnight, correct? Like, we have to look at this deeply.
Mm-mm. Tom, we're lucky we just had an election in this country the other day, just last Tuesday, and already we're seeing a rejection of these extreme views about policing. In Minneapolis, the scene of the George Floyd homicide, jury found him, the cop, guilty of murder.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, we see a rejection of a proposal to eliminate the police department and replace it with a Department of Public Safety. And a pretty broad margin, a majority of the voters rejected this. So I think we're turning the corner. I think, and I hope that we're turning the corner here, and that people realize that these extreme proposals are non-starters. Uh,
Yeah.
you want to eliminate the police? Okay, great. Who's gonna serve their functions? You have to ask reasonable questions. Well, the public's already seen past that, and they rejected it. So I'm hoping we've turned the corner here, and that maybe we can enter a period where there'll be rational discussion. The fear, of course, is that we may have another incident, white cop, black citizen who gets shot. The circumstances may be, uh, let's say, controversial without prejudging, and maybe we'll be off again. Maybe we'll be off and running again with protests and riots and complaints. I hope not. I hope we can have rational discussion. Um, I'll tell you, Tom, what I'm really worried about too is the election in counties of prosecutors who seem determined not to prosecute. In Manhattan, which is New York County, we just saw the election of a prosecutor, a DA, and I was just reading his statements this morning. Very bright guy, Harvard graduate, Harvard Law, very smart fellow. And essentially he says, I'm not going to prosecute low-level offenses.
Yes.
But why? His only argument was apparently that it's racially skewed. Excuse me, but all the offenses were racially skewed.
Right.
Murders are racially skewed too. You're going to stop prosecuting murders? I
Yeah.
mean, what is he talking about? So New York is in for trouble. Manhattan is going to be in trouble if he really carries this out. He said, I'm not going to prosecute people who jump the turnstiles. Really? I'm sure the transit authority was going to be delighted to hear that. This will bust their budget wide open. As soon as people learn that no one's prosecuted for it, what will happen? Kind of obvious, isn't it? All the young guys will, I won't jump a turnstile. I'm too old to jump a turnstile, but all the young guys will be jumping turnstiles. So these things make no sense to me. And while on the one hand, I'm hoping we've turned the corner, on the other hand, the election of these prosecutors is, to me, a scary thing.
This is an issue that seems to come up more and more. The progressive district attorney. In Los Angeles area, there's Gascon in Chicago area, that Kim Foxx, and you see this more and more where I think it was actually Mayor Lightfoot went public against the Kim Foxx because there was a shooting that took place and people are in custody and they're calling it mutual combat. Like, and for people that don't know, mutual combat, if I show up to a scene and there was a fight at a house and it's two brothers, they got into some fisticuffs. It's not a husband and a wife. It's not like a domestic violence, but it's two brothers, maybe two neighbors. They get into it, they shake hands and they're fine. And they both have a black eye. We write that off as, okay, this is a mutual combat event. Sure, technically a battery was committed, but these are two people that got into it, it got heated, they're friends, and it's fine. We're not going to put people in jail for this. This is a mutual combat. It's over. Something within family. You don't say mutual combat when rival gangs are shooting at one another. That's criminal. But what is the goal here? So I don't even know if you've thought on this or pulled on this thread. I often hear the name George Soros attached. Do you have any knowledge of this? Is this a thing?
Yeah, I've heard it too. And the Open Society, I think, is his organization, and apparently he's funding some of their campaigns. How much there is to this, in truth, Tom, I really don't know. I've heard it too. I've heard it said. It may be true. I just don't know.
Okay.
What amazes me really is that the public would support this kind of thing at a time, especially when you were seeing rising crime and this kind of misbehavior. Now, I don't think we're headed for a big crime wave. We could talk about that one momentarily.
Yeah.
But there's definitely been a spike. There's no question there's a spike. We have more crime and more disorder. And people are upset by that sort of stuff. So it amazes me that they will vote for it. Now, they say, all politics is local, right? A lot of truth to that. I know Manhattan. Manhattan has a lot of liberals, and apparently they voted for this guy to be district attorney. His name is Bragg, by the way, Bragg. They voted for this guy to be district attorney, and they wouldn't vote for a Republican, if it was Jesus come back. And that's just how it is. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
That's Manhattan, and that's always going to be Manhattan. So I understand that one, okay? But I really don't understand why people who are facing more disorder, a crime spike, would support this kind of prosecutor who, in effect, is nullifying the misdemeanor and violation laws of the state. He's saying, well, the law may be there, but I'm not prosecuting it. Wow.
Yeah.
I don't
Yeah.
get that at all. I just don't get that. I just read Bratton's book, by the way, Tom, just to inject another thought. Just read Bratton's book. And, Bratton's, one of his big ideas was broken windows policing. Means a lot of different things to a lot of people. But one of the things it means to Bratton is you arrest these low-level offenses, like, let's say, fare beats, turnstile jumpers. And then you check their records to see if they have outstanding warrants.
Right.
Which means, of course, they had previous arrests, sometimes for serious offenses. And then after their initial show up in court because they were in jail and couldn't get out, the judge releases them, tells them to come back for their hearing, and of course they never show up again. Mm-hmm. Whereupon the judge issues a warrant. Now that's sort of standard fare in big cities, right? Okay, so now they bust the guy because he jumps the turnstile in the subway. And whoa, you got 7 prior warrants issued, right? He never showed up. Big surprise, right? He isn't law-abiding. Yeah. But now you could bust him for the 7, can't you? You could bust him for the previous crimes where he was never brought to justice. So Bratton says we need to be able to arrest for these minor offenses in order to catch the bigger ones. Mm-hmm. Now, how often does this happen? We could debate that, and criminologists should study that. Fine. But it does happen. And Bratton, if he were to become commissioner again in New York, would be very unhappy with Mr. Bragg, I'm sure. Because what will happen when they stop prosecuting, let's say, the turnstile jumper? The cops won't arrest him.
Right.
Why would you? Why would a cop make an arrest which isn't going to even be a prosecution? It's not going to result in a prosecution. So the cops will say, no, we're not going to arrest them. So it'll be free rides on the subways. That's what it'll be. But Bratton's point, it'll not only be free rides on the subways, it'll be fewer guys who are arrested with outstanding warrants who've done serious crimes. That's the broken windows argument.
Absolutely. I had the honor of serving under Chief Bratton when he was at our agency. And I'm a big fan of his. I like his work. Anything he puts out, I try to consume. I like his ideas, and I think he sees a great big picture. So much you talked about. So I also spoke with Professor Mosques, Peter, and he talks about how these low-level offenses, he said, people get mad at us because we'd see a couple of guys on the corner shooting dice, and they don't like that. Well, why are you messing with us? Because when you lose enough in dice, somebody gets stabbed. So we see this as a dice game. He said, but an hour from now, when somebody loses their rent money and they say, I'm not paying, and they say, no, you're paying, it turns into a homicide. So let's break up the dice game. And I don't think people understand the nexus to that. The turnstile jumper isn't the med student who just doesn't have enough money to pay for this, who's just trying to get to school, but needed to buy a loaf of bread today, in order to survive. Those nexuses don't exist. This is criminal behavior. And we know that behavior begets other behavior. We see it because when we make arrests and I run rap sheets, and you see somebody who's never had an offense, it's like the unicorn. I mean, people will walk around the station and they'll say, what do you have? What's in the tank, or who's on the bench? Oh yeah, it's so-and-so with this crime. Dude, no rap sheet, nothing. And everybody's like, really? Nothing? Like nothing, not a drop. And we're always like, wow, this is crazy. Either they got away with it for that long, or this is truly the first time. And usually you see it with like a DUI, that's a common time. But with a crime, like a real crime, like an ADW, assault with a deadly weapon, or attempt murder, and it's their first one, it's a unicorn event. So I agree with that. Now, do you ever get into the CompStat way of policing? Okay, so you have some knowledge on that. I wonder what you think about this. I've thought about it, and I think it was great, and it's an accountability tool, but it became obsessive when officers were only judged now by arrests. So an officer goes on the beat, they make 3 arrests, good job. But the next day, because of their enforcement, things have settled down a little bit. Don't jump the turnstiles, Officer Datro's out there, whatever it is. But then that officer, they say, well, where's your numbers? You're not productive. So now the officers are hunting. And what ends up happening is you get these disparate stops. You stop 100 people for minor traffic violations, administrative violations, hoping to find somebody with the warrant. Can you see that sort of trend as this became a good tool that then lost its way?
I think that could happen. I'm not an expert on it. I wish my buddy Eli Silverman were here. He is an expert. He wrote one of the earliest books on it. And then he found something interesting, Tom, along the lines that you were presenting about abuses of it. He found that in New York, the police departments, the cops themselves, were under so much pressure to reduce the number of misdemeanors that they were essentially reduce the number of felonies. Mm-hmm. They were charging misdemeanors. They were reducing felonies to misdemeanors wherever they could in order to reduce the number of felonies in the precinct. Yeah. So you got funny numbers as well. So I guess my answer is any policy you adopt requires monitoring and follow-up. And you got to talk to the people in the field to see what's really going on. Because I guess after a time, whatever the policy is, even if it's successful at first, it may be abused later on. I'm sure there are studies on this, and I'm sure there are experts who could speak to this better than I can. Mm-hmm. But it just seems to me that a policy, even if it's successful initially, might produce, let's say, unwarranted or unanticipated consequences that are just not acceptable. Here's another example of that: stop and frisk, or as NYPD called it, stop, question, and frisk. Now, the original concept sounded right. Mm-hmm. You want to prevent people from committing crimes with guns. So how are you going to do that? So the concept was, we'll stop people with reasonable suspicion, of course, because that's required by the law. We'll interview them. If we suspect on further examination that they may be armed, we're entitled to frisk them. And then if there's a weapon, we're entitled to extract it. And of course, if it's illegal, we keep it.
Right.
So this is a good concept. The idea was to make it, as Mayor Bloomberg said, too hot to carry. In other words, put enough police on this so that you won't have people carrying weapons in the streets, and therefore you'd have less gun violence. Good concept. But what happened, of course, is, as we all know, they kept adding the numbers of stops. They had untutored, inexperienced officers carrying out the stops. Yep. They ended up doing millions and millions of stops, and very few involved any real offense. And so there was huge resentment, a lot of it racially driven, and boom, the whole thing blew up in their faces. Yep. So here's another example then. of a policy that starts right, makes sense, and then simply produces so many unanticipated, so many negative consequences that you end up having to abandon the whole policy. So I
Yeah.
guess I would say, and this is so general, I don't know what value it has, but I guess I would say you must follow up on any policy. You must check in the field to see how it's being implemented. And you need to review it periodically to see if it's still working and if it's still worth doing. Because I guess almost every policy may start out looking great and may
Hmm.
not end up that way.
Yeah, I was having a conversation with my brother-in-law, and I tried to draw this analogy. He's an engineer, so I had to pressure test it. I said the energy it takes to get the plane off the ground is different than the energy it takes to sustain it. And so the plane getting off the ground with lift and thrust was the crime. We need to get these guns. And so you do it, and then you get to a level like, okay, we're starting to see the trends. We're bringing crimes down. You don't just keep climbing and keep burning that energy because it's going to fail. Eventually, you have to top off and you say, okay, we got it to an acceptable level. Now let's start implementing some strategies for maintenance and then slow gains, slow altitude gains, which kind of leads me to another area of your expertise is the crime and the trends of the crime. And I'm reading through your work and I'm listening to your podcast, and it's amazing. You talked about the ebb and flow of this, and you mentioned you don't think we're headed for a crime wave. What brings you to that conclusion?
So, first of all, a wave or a boom, whatever you want to call it, is a multi year phenomenon.
Multi-year.
We're not talking about I differentiate spikes from waves.
Okay.
Okay. And I don't want to split hairs here, but it's very simple to understand, right?
Sure.
A spike is a year, a spike is 2 years, a wave is multiple years. Now, I'm old enough to remember the horrors of the 70s
Mm-hmm.
and especially the late 80s. Uh, this was a real wave, a real boom. I called it a crime tsunami because it
Yeah.
was more than a wave. This was really tremendously destructive in big cities in the United States, especially, but almost every place in the United States. Now,
Yeah.
this started, and, and, and when I saw that no one really researched this, that's when I wrote my first crime history, The Rise and Fall of Violent Crime. I wanted to see, well, why did this happen? Why did it really die down? And so I looked at the factors behind the big crime wave that started in the late 1960s and really didn't end till the early 1990s. So
Wow.
that's over 25 years, over 2.5 decades. And what did I find? I found that the migration to big cities of people with high crime rates, mainly African Americans, but not exclusively, many Latinos, again, not exclusively, was a big factor in the crime rise.
Hmm.
Do I see this kind of migration of high crime groups to cities nowadays? No, I do not.
Ah.
Second factor, demographic. We had a baby boom. Why? Because the fellas came home from World War II and wanted to have families. This was
Right.
encouraged. Lots of kids were born at the end of the war in the early 50s. Unfortunately, when these kids grew up, they weren't very nice kids. By the time they reached 18, 20, up to 25, they were engaging in high levels of violent crime. You had an enormous youth bulge, and some demographers slash criminologists concluded that the youth bulge alone was accountable for a lot of the
Wow.
crime wave. Why would that be? Because we know, as police of course know, who commits the violent crime. It's mainly males between ages 18 and 25.
Mm-hmm.
And so if you increase the number of males between the ages of 18 and 25, you're going to naturally get a big crime increase. So
Mm.
that was factor two. Factor three, we believed back then in rehabilitation. We believed in minimizing the criminal justice consequences of crime. And when I did the research, I found, Tom, that by 1970, the likelihood of arrest for crime had diminished.
Yeah.
The likelihood of punishment for crime had diminished. And the amount of punishment, the time served for each crime, had gone down as well. So in other words, we had this sort of caving of the criminal justice system in the late 60s, early 70s. In fact, the more crime you get, the more caving there was, because the police, the courts, the judges, the prisons simply didn't have the resources to handle the big crime increase. Well, what happens when you have a criminal justice system that's caving? You get more crime. It's an incentive. It's like the turnstile jumpers not being prosecuted anymore. You get more incentive to crime. So those, I found, were the big three factors in the crime wave: the influx of high crime groups, the baby boom demographic, the big increase in young people, especially young males, and the weakness of the criminal justice system. Those three were the big three, and that's what I found. Now, by the late 80s, you have an enhancement, if you will. You have one additional factor, and that was crack cocaine. And you have these gangs, these distribution gangs, who were killing one another and occasionally innocent bystanders to protect their turf in the distribution of cocaine. And then you have also people who become addicted. They're poor. They can't afford to support their habits. They go off and rob and steal to meet their addiction needs. The women engage in prostitution. And so there you have more crime as a result of cocaine. Once the cocaine thing ended, early 90s, once the baby boomers outgrew the violent years, then crimes, and once the criminal justice system toughened up because of people like Bratton and got smarter, then you had the decline of violent crime. So what do I see now? I don't see the elements of a boom. We have more aging population than we have youth population. We don't have an influx of minorities who have high crime rates. People coming into the country, now I'm not talking about illegals crossing the border now, but people coming into the country are often middle-class people, highly skilled people. They don't have high crime rates. And finally, the criminal justice system was toughened up. This is what happened in the 90s, the days when Joe Biden supported a tougher criminal justice system, I should add. The system was toughened up, and therefore the system now is tougher, much tougher than it was in the late 60s. So that's why I don't see a crime boom. I think the spike is in part due to the pandemic, to people to police pulling back because of fear of infections, and the protests. The police were diverted to cover protests and had to be taken off the beats where they were preventing violent crimes and other important serious property crimes. So I see that as a short term, a year, maybe 2 years for that. And then we'll go back where we were. That's the optimistic scenario.
Do you see, I had a talk with Mr. Robert Verbruggen, was talking about the case for like getting back to work as cops, like, you know, stop pulling back, don't do these. When you hear these officers say they don't want to be the next viral video, and why bother even prosecuting this? Because DAs aren't going to file. Do you see maybe where some other elements could come in and allow this to start, this wave to start building?
Absolutely, because remember the one factor, Tom, was the weakness in the criminal justice system, right? That was a big factor. So here we are sitting on the limb and sawing it off, right? Here we are saying, well, we're not going to prosecute low-level crimes. Excuse me, but that's what upsets people. People don't want to see others defecating in the street. They don't want to see
Right.
bunches of kids jumping in the turnstiles and entering into the subways for free. They don't want to see graffiti come back and destruction of public property. They don't want to see this. They're upset by disorder as well as by crime. So, yeah, that's why it concerns me to see these prosecutors who say, I'm not going to prosecute, because to me, this is a mark of a weakened criminal justice system. And that's a big element in crime waves. So, yeah, if we keep it up, if we keep being foolish, if we keep
Mm-hmm.
weakening the criminal justice system, we're asking for trouble.
About that, the DAs seem to have the idea that we're prosecuting too many low-level offenses. Now, you have the data on this, and I will hear this phrase or some version of it. The prisons are full of low-level drug offenders. And what has your research yielded in that claim?
That's preposterous. The prisons are filled with repeaters who've done serious crimes. Of the roughly 14, 15% of prisons who are in for drugs, 12% or so are drug dealers,
Mm-hmm.
not just drug possessors.
Mm-hmm.
So it's rubbish. I mean, not only don't they end up in prison, they don't even end up in jail anymore for low-level crimes. Misdemeanors are out. That's the
Yep.
first point. Many felonies, as you and I know, Tom, are reduced to misdemeanors anyway, and
Right.
and and they don't go to prison. As for the ones who do go to prison, we know that they're recidivists. We know that they repeat. So they not only do serious crimes, but they repeat them. The figures are startling. When they did a study, the federal government did a study of people who were released from prison, they found 83% repeated crimes. I don't mean the same crime, but they repeated
Yep.
serious crimes within 9 years of their release, mostly within the first year. So they're recidivists, they're serious offenders, they're not just kids smoking pot. This is utter rubbish. You got to check the numbers.
And that's what I try to say, but I wanted the expert to cite on this. What about this idea? I also hear this: the prison industrial complex. We can't decarcerate. We need mass incarceration for the private prisons. What do we know about this idea of prison industrial complex?
Private prisons house maybe 7% of all prisoners. So 93% of the prisoners are in public prisons. Is
Okay.
there any evidence that the private prisons are more poorly managed, more brutal, more racist? Not that I know of. I've never seen that evidence. They're probably better run than a lot of the public prisons. But without proof of that, then there goes the argument. That's the end of the argument. This is a red herring. This is a non-issue. There's no point in having that discussion. But the whole discussion flips back again to the whole question of whether we're over incarcerating. Exactly the points I'm going to address in my next book, and I have addressed in the book forthcoming. Uh, and the evidence is just not there, Tom. It's just not there. The evidence is that we have many, many crimes, serious crimes, that are not fully prosecuted and are not punished when they are prosecuted. They're not punished sufficiently when they are prosecuted. So, without sounding like one of these hang 'em high law and order freaks, you have to deal with the realities of the world. You can't just say, end the police, stop policing,
Right.
close all the prisons. By the way, some are saying close all the prisons.
Oh
Unbelievable. I
yeah.
address this stuff in my book. I mean, it's just unbelievable. They're living on cloud la la land. They really are.
Yeah, it's interesting being, and I'm not a big social media presence by any means, but even my little small sliver of retail space on the internet will get people saying, "Oh, here's another person who wants to keep people in prison," and it's like, well, the comments you get from the wacky ideas, just to give people some idea of the numbers. You need to say this. This is your I get from you 18 million crimes. a year. 18 million, 18.6 really, but 18 million crimes, 10 million arrests. And how many of those are going to prison? 577,000. So when we say over incarceration, we could potentially, you would say out of those 10 million arrests, 50% of them, you say, just being conservative, you could put 5 million people. This is annually, right? We could do this annually. And we have a prison population of about 2.2 million, give or take, which has dropped even more. So, like you say, the argument has no bearing when you say this and you look at the trend lines. Now, have you looked into alternative sentencing at all? Is there a case for that? Like a legitimate alternative setting, not just saying I'm not going to do it, but programs.
If we look at alternatives to prison, we don't see anything that's very encouraging for serious crimes. For the less serious crimes, maybe, but not for serious crimes, which is part of the problem. I mean, people who want to de-prison America, the burden's on them really to offer alternatives.
Right.
And it has to be remembered too, Tom, the public, every criminal justice system is based in part on the concept of retribution. The punishment should fit the crime. Right. You really can't have a system that's going to survive very long unless you build this principle into it. So if you soften the punishment too much for serious offenses, for murder, robbery, rape, and so on down the line, the public isn't going to stand for it because the injustice, the lack of really retribution, punishment fitting the crime, will be too glaring, and the public's not going to accept that. So you have to keep that in mind. Whatever we come up with as an alternative, it has to build in this retributive factor. The next factor, of course, is there has to be enough deterrence to protect the public. Unless they're executed, they're going to be released at some point. When they're released, will they repeat? If they're released too soon, will that encourage others to do the same type of offense? So we have to build in deterrence sufficient to protect the public. So when you look at alternatives, there aren't too many good alternatives. One thing I propose in this book is that we should do more electronic monitoring. But I think electronic monitoring is better suited to people who are on probation because they've already been released instead of imprisoned, and people who are released to parole after they've served time in prison. So we have lots of those people, and we know that they recidivate, and we could reduce the recidivism if we do more electronic monitoring. Now, you know, whether it's considered punitive or not punitive, I won't debate. But what I will say is this: it's a good idea to prevent recidivism. It's a good idea to prevent repeating. It's a good idea to ensure greater compliance by probationers and parolees. So what's wrong with that? That sounds right to me. So I'd like to see a big expansion of electronic monitoring. Now, I read an article by a couple of people from Australia who said, well, if we can monitor people and actually see how they're behaving, we might get to the point where electronic monitoring could really prevent crime. I guess they meant mainly by parolees, because we're not all going to be wired up.
Right.
So I'm not so optimistic about that. But anyway, fine. If we could reach a point where electronic monitoring can be used to determine behaviors, fine. It'll make it more effective. So, you know, I'm in favor of that. I vote yes. But there are no good alternatives to imprisonment, to incarceration. If there were, let's hear them. Let's talk about that.
I have this goal, and I'm curious to not goal. I have this idea, And I'm curious to think if this has legs. I hear all too often the school to prison pipeline or the streets to prison pipeline.
Yeah.
Is there a space in the future for a prison to society pipeline? And maybe when we see, hey, you're going to be getting out soon, you are mandatory going to enroll in classes where you are going to learn to build transmissions or install solar panels or train dogs or whatever it is. We're not just going to let you out and then roll the dice and good luck and you're going to fall back into these things. We're going to prepare you for society. Is there any, it just feels like prison is this retribution and now you're going to be punished. And it is almost like go to your room and do nothing. But maybe we can be more constructive with how we do this.
I sure hope so, Tom. It would be good. I was just in preparing for this book, the early ideas on rehabilitation were along the lines that you've just suggested. By the late 19th century, there were proposals. A man named, of all things, Zebulon Brockway proposed and actually ran prison in New York at Elmira to train people so that when they get out, they would have jobs, they'd be able to hold down jobs, and they'd be rehabilitated. Now, I don't want to get into the weeds with Zebulon Brockway and his ideas, but I just want to point out that this notion that we could train people and produce more law-abiding people out of prisoners is not new. It's at least 150 years old. The problem is we haven't figured out how to do that either. And that's the saddest thing of all to me. And we've sort of abandoned it. There are programs in prisons, but not enough of them probably. And even these programs, Tom, they only usually work when you have a threat of re-imprisonment behind them. And that's kind of sad, isn't it?
It is.
So boy, I wish you were right. If we could come up with some sort of way to train people to ensure that they could have jobs and hold down jobs after they were released and live law-abiding lives instead of committing more crimes, that would be wonderful. That would certainly reduce recidivism. It would reduce reincarceration. It would be a great thing for these people themselves, for the prisoners themselves. So, yeah, I'm all in favor of trying, Tom. I'm all in favor of looking into more and more of these options. I'm not that hopeful, but I would encourage it.
Well, then to me, that's good because I got the hopeful component and you got all the knowledge. So I think another book downrange that you could see would be this idea, and we'll build off the work of Zebulon Brockway on that. Professor, I want to be very respectful of your time, and I also want to have you back on to talk more about it. So with your permission, I think I'm going to bring this to a close on that happy note, that there may be a future out there that there's some people who are listening can maybe work on or grab that and, hey, let's partner up, send messages and send emails, and maybe there's a way we can figure out, crack that nut, if you will.
It's going to be Datro and Latzer, this next book. Notice who gets first billing too, Tom.
That is outstanding, Professor. I very much appreciate your time and sharing your knowledge. It was a delight to have you on, and I look forward to having you on again.
Thanks so much, Tom, and I really appreciate it. It was a pleasure talking to you.
You as well, sir. Very nice to meet you. Bye-bye.
Bye now.